Welcome to CUNY Laureates, the show about CUNY graduates who went on to win major awards in their respective fields. On this episode, we profile 3 MacArthur Fellows who graduated from the City College of New York. First, Stanley Nelson, whose films dive into Black American experience from the early 20th century up to the present day. Next, the story of Irving Howe, whose intellectual rigor informed a new generation of thinkers in America and helped pave the way for socialist dissent. Finally, we learn about Lawrence Levine's lifelong struggle to put ordinary people front and center in American history. Our next genius attended film school here at City College, hoping to become a director of fiction movies. But an apprenticeship forever altered the trajectory of Stanley Nelson's film career. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a MacArthur Fellow and whose searing documentaries look to the past, present, and future. The 1970s in film were a groundbreaking era that saw the rise of independent filmmakers, hard-hitting socially relevant content, and new ideas and techniques.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
During this historical time in filmmaking, Stanley Nelson was at City College as a film student, and there was something else he noticed on film screens around New York City.
It was kind of the blaxploitation era, so suddenly there were films about black folks and black people were getting behind the camera, which was never an opportunity before that.
After starting in the film program at Hunter College, Stanley enrolled at the Leonard Davis Film School at City College, which had just opened.
What I wanted to do was make fiction films. Making documentary films that I ended up doing never even occurred to me. I thought documentary films were boring, and the films that they would roll into your classroom when you're in high school, and they were really boring, and somebody droning on with an English accent.
Who extracts the finished component and then repeats the process.
Nelson wrote film reviews for a City College paper, earning a parallel education to the one in class, as his press pass gave him unlimited access to theatrical films.
I remember one of my reviews said, that as African Americans and Latinx, we should try to go see Italian movies, Japanese movies, other cultures' movies, because they might have just as much to do with our lives as Hollywood. Hollywood isn't about our lives, and maybe some of these movies are closer to our lives than Hollywood.
But it was after graduation where his education and career took flight.
I lucked out and got a job with William Greaves Productions, and they did documentaries.
William Greaves was the preeminent black documentarian of his time and a graduate of City College. He made over 200 films on topics ranging from Booker T. Washington to the Harlem Renaissance.
The documentary is a very important part of the African American filmmaking experience, because you'll find that in order to get at the truth of the African American experience, you must use the documentary, because there are too many theatrical licenses that are applied to feature films that will distract you and deflect you from what the actual truth of a situation.
I saw a black man, who was supporting his family, through making documentary films, and had a business and was able to make that work. It influenced me not only in terms of my career and learning all different parts of making films, but also in the fact that it was possible to do it.
We are men! He was waking up America.
Since working with William Greaves, Stanley has produced and/or directed upwards of 55 films, covering a wide range of American stories: policing in the black community, A Buy of Harriet Tubman, the Attica prison uprising, the 1921 massacre in Tulsa. He produced, directed, and did sound on his first film, $2 in a Dream, the story of Madam C.J. Walker, in 1989.
But if it came right down to it, what she did What makes it beautiful?
I'm trying to tell the story, mainly, African American stories, because that's the culture I come from. When I tell those stories, I can dive so much deeper than somebody who's parachuting in, and trying to tell a story of, the Black Panthers, or Freedom Riders.
The Black Panthers.
Black Panthers.
The Black Panther Party.
Black Panther movement.
The Black Panthers were absolutely unique.
One of the greatest interviews I ever did was I interviewed one of the Black Panthers. And he was talking about the siege that they had in LA, where the police surrounded the Black Panther office and they were shooting in, and 500 cops were surrounding the Panthers, and the Panthers were shooting back. The Panthers were running out of bullets, and they were all shot. And I said to him, how do you feel? How did you feel? Right? The greatest interview I ever did. I said, the question was simple, how do you feel? And he looked me in my eye and said, I felt great. I was a black man making my own way. They couldn't get in and they couldn't get out. I was the king of myself right there, okay? If he was talking to you, he would have said, well, I felt kind of good because after 400 years of being, of slavery and blah, 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 he would have had to explain all. The thing that he was saying was, you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, came out in 2015. A later film, Attica, was nominated for numerous awards, including an Oscar, and won him an Outstanding Director Award from the Directors Guild of America. Nelson's use of archival footage and footage from today makes for a potent combination.
We look at archival footage as a real character in the film. All my films live in the past and the present. It's important that the films don't live in what I call a historic bubble. All of our films are looking at the past so that we can inform today.
His documentary about Miles Davis, part of PBS's American Masters series, is a good illustration of the value of digging deep for archival footage.
We were talking to a guy who was Miles's friend, and I said, well, do you have any pictures? And he said, yeah, actually, Miles said, if you got a camera, you can take some pictures of me, I don't care. Then he said, I went to UCLA and took a film class, and I bought a 16mm film camera, and I took films of Miles. And I said, oh yeah, well, do you have them? He said, yeah, I got them in my basement. Nobody had ever seen that before.
There was a mob, looking like 1,000 people. They had these iron pipes.
They were screaming, kill them.
Finding the archival footage and matching it to the stories he chooses to tell has been Stanley Nelson's strength over almost 35 years of filmmaking. He won the MacArthur Genius Grant in 2002, was awarded the National Medal in the Humanities by President Obama in 2013, has won 3 Primetime Emmys, and was awarded a Peabody in 2015.
I wanted to tell the stories that I didn't see being told. And I think it's not only important what we put in front of the camera, but it's also important that we think about who's behind the camera. I'm trying to make films that are oftentimes about big stories, like the Black Panthers, Freedom Riders. I'm not trying to insert myself into the story. I'm trying to tell a story about this thing, that's there. I mean, there's a certain way I could tell it. I could tell it, I could tell my story. I could say, that, and this would be a true story. When I was 17, I went to the Black Panther office in Harlem and was about to, sign up for the Black Panthers. And then me and my friend were like, I don't think so. We're not going to do that. And I could tell it from that point of view, right? And that would be perfectly valid. But that's not the way I want to tell these stories. I think they're so much bigger than me. And I don't think that I need to insert myself into the story.
Stanley continues to direct and produce for Firelight Films. Firelight Media, a nonprofit company started with his wife, Marcia Smith, is dedicated to showcasing emerging filmmakers of color by helping to fund and produce their work through a number of programs, including the William Graves Research and Development Fund.
There's so many more filmmakers, and there's so many more black documentary filmmakers who are making great films. The whole idea of documentary films has just exploded. So there's just a much more of a recognition of documentary film as something that's viable, as something that people want to watch.
Irving Howe spent most of his life engaged in intellectual discourse while debating the merits of socialism, literature, and the working class. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a MacArthur Fellow and helped set the tone for left-wing ideas throughout the 20th century, starting right here in the alcoves of City College.
It was the 1930s, a time between two world wars and a time when Joseph Stalin had consolidated power in the Soviet Union. At the City College of New York, far from the USSR, debates were raging.
There was an atmosphere of fervid, overly heated, overly excited intellectuality.
This is Irving Howe, who was a young student at the college. He was in the thrall of Leon Trotsky, the Russian communist whose ideas directly opposed the authoritarian Stalinism of the time. The real center of life at City College was in our Alcove 1. Here gathered Trotskyists, socialists, with their books, pamphlets, ragged overcoats, and cheese sandwiches. You could walk into the thick brown darkness of Alcove 1 and find a convenient argument about the Popular Front in France, the New Deal in America, the Civil War in Spain, and what Marx really meant. In these early years, Howe's debate group included Irving Kristol, Daniel Bell, and Nathan Glazer. These four men would go on to have an outsized influence on American life in the 20th century. Howe grew up in a poor family in the East Bronx, where the roots of socialism began to percolate in the young thinker's mind.
I had some sense of first a little bit of self-pity, but then afterwards of indignation, and also a feeling that that our own experience in the slums in the East Bronx were not all that different from those of other people. Finally, it had a kind of liberating experience. It enabled one to see that one's life was shared with that of other people.
It was this concept of sharing life with other people, the empathy for others, that helped Howe consider ideas of democratic socialism, a political mode that gives voice to ordinary people, an idea fiercely opposed to the ruthlessness of capitalism and in favor of dismantling it while keeping democratic traditions afloat.
I think it's one of the virtues of this country. People do think that democracy is a pretty good thing.
And this idea captivated Howe. After graduating from City College, he served in World War II, albeit not on the front lines.
I had been partly transformed by my experiences in the Army. I spent 2 years in Alaska. It was like a graduate school for me. During that time, I read a good many books. There was nothing else to do up there. I began to develop incipient literary inclinations to move away from being just political. And I began to contribute a book review here, a book review there.
When Howe returned, he began in earnest his career as a writer, starting to shape mid-century intellectual life in America. This was a time in American history when the public intellectual was a force to be reckoned with, and one that shaped the politics of the time. Howe began to write for the Partisan Review, one of the most significant literary and political journals of the time. He contributed to other publications, including Commentary, The New Republic, and the New York Review of Books. In other words, Irving Howe became a key contributor to the intellectual life of the nation. He was a renowned literary critic. He wrote on William Faulkner, Robert Frost, Sherwood Anderson, and others, but also put forth his democratic socialist ideas and social critiques. Towards the middle of the 1950s, he saw a profound schism in the thinking of people like his old debate nemesis, Irving Kristol.
In 1954, I published an article called This Age of Conformity. A kind of scattershot attack on the whole intellectual world for losing its tradition of intellectual independence, its social radicalism, its passion for criticism. The tendency in the intellectual world in the 1950s was toward conformity, was toward making peace with the status quo, or the status quo of American capitalist society, and I was against that.
And from this, in the shadow of the McCarthy hearings that cast a pall on the left in America, was birthed Dissent magazine. Howe founded Dissent alongside Louis Kozer as an answer to this conformity.
The purpose of this new magazine is suggested by its name, to dissent from the bleak atmosphere of conformism that pervades the political and intellectual life of the United States. To dissent from the support of the status quo, now so noticeable on the part of many former radicals and socialists. To dissent from the terrible assumption that a new war is necessary or inevitable, and that the only way to defeat Stalinism is through atomic world suicide.
Around the same time, Howe began to teach at City College, and he remained there for almost 25 years, also teaching at the Graduate Center. But in the mid-1950s, he saw that Irving Kristol had drifted further and further rightward politically, eventually inventing neoconservatism, which made the publication of Dissent that much more urgent. Howe stayed to the left politically, espousing democratic socialism through the pages of his magazine, for which he was the editor for many years.
The accent of Dissent will be radical. Its tradition will be the tradition of democratic socialism. We shall try to reassert the libertarian values of the socialist ideal, and at the same time to discuss freely and honestly what in the socialist tradition remains alive and what needs to be discarded or modified.
Howe's intellectualism had a place in the real world. In the early 1970s, he helped to start Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which merged with the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. And if we move 30 years ahead, we can see that Bernie Sanders, himself a New York-born Jew and Brooklyn College alumni, carries the mantle of democratic socialism to the present day.
Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system which is corrupt, that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy.
And if, for example, there were a candidate in the next national election who represented what the young people would feel, what I would feel too, was a genuine sort of left liberal impulse for social change and for moral regeneration in the country, I think we'd find that thousands of kids would once again be out on the hustings, as would I.
In 1987, at age 67, Howe was awarded a MacArthur Award. He had also won a Guggenheim years before that. Howe remained relevant and engaged to the end of his life.
He was a man who stumbled into socialism, but his magazine, Dissent, remains in print today, with essays on topic titles like How to Repair the Planet, The Archaeology of Hope, and What Socialist Politicians Can Do. In other words, the foundation that Irving Howe built in 1954 has a through line to today. People still feel the urge to fight for the democratic socialism that Howe wrote about over hundreds of essays and dozens of books, over a lifetime dedicated to the mind and to the notion of a true democracy in America.
What about your own faith in the democratic institutions?
The one absolutely indispensable thing. I oppose anyone who, in the name of some better world, proposes to destroy the freedoms that we have. I want to see those freedoms expanded, enlarged, improved, and purified. But in order to do that, they first have to be preserved. There are a lot of violations of democracy, but in my debates with New Left students, I often had to explain that the fact that we have a violation of democracy does not mean that democracy is absent. On the contrary, it means that we have it.
History. A very, very long account of great battles, powerful people, their even more powerful cousins, bureaucrats and their bosses, accomplished soldiers and their generals. Oh yes, and a curiously small number of very powerful women. But what about ordinary people? Our next genius was just that, an ordinary man with an extraordinary talent to turn history on its head. This is a story of a CUNY graduate who became a MacArthur Fellow and his lifelong efforts to promote multiculturalism and perspectives of ordinary people in the study of American history. The problem is that historians have tended to spend too much of their time in the company of the movers and shakers, and too little in the universe of the mass of mankind. Lawrence Levine writes in the prologue of his Black Culture and Black Consciousness. It is 1977, and Larry has already spent most of his life fighting against traditionalist views. Growing up in the midst of the Great Depression, Larry developed a strong sense of history at a very early age. His parents spent hours listening to Fireside Chats, a series of evening radio addresses hosted by none other but the big man himself, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Think things through.
His parents' admiration for this important man only grew stronger after he signed the Declaration of War on December 8, 1941. America was at war, and Larry, still too young to join the fight, couldn't do much more than focus on helping his father operate his fruit store in Washington Heights. Ironically, it was here, thousands of miles from the conflict, where he witnessed something that had a lasting impact on his perception of history. Every morning while setting up his store, his father would gather ripe fruit that he couldn't sell the day before and share it with people in need. As they formed a line in front of the store, these ordinary men and women, each with their own unique story, would discuss world politics, analyze markets, and tell stories about heroes and villains who fought overseas. As he listened to their discussions, Larry started wondering, would anybody but him ever hear their stories? Is history going to remember them? The fact that his father's store offered a 10% discount to school teachers didn't help Larry achieve higher marks in school. A self-described screw-up in high school, Larry joined the ranks of City College in 1951. A rowdy political climate the college was known for at the time sounded like a good fit for his somewhat unconventional understanding of the human condition and discipline. Yet, before long, Larry started developing a completely new set of concerns, this time of a more intellectual nature. We studied Northern and Western Europe, he said in his interview for the New York Times in 1996. Nothing on Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Even Canada was a blank. This lack of historical perspective, common for curricula of the majority of universities at the time, had a major impact on Larry's career. If one of the most progressive educational institutions in the country taught very little about the majority of the people in the world, what was happening in the rest of the country? After graduating with a degree in history from City College in 1955 and getting his PhD from Columbia under the mentorship of the famed historian Richard Hofstadter, Larry briefly taught at City College in Princeton before receiving an offer from Berkeley. It was 1963 in California, and tensions were running high. Almost immediately upon arrival, Larry took part in civil rights sit-ins and in 1964 got involved with the free speech movement at Berkeley campus. Reminiscing about his experiences, he later stated, "The Berkeley free speech movement coincided with the beginnings of that whole long period, that painful, interesting period of protests on the war, which kept everyone hopping, There was a lot of optimism in that period. We had a large group of fantastic undergraduates and graduates who were lively, dynamic, and maybe naive, but open to all kinds of things. Throughout the 1960s, he repeatedly witnessed patterns of social interaction that suggested that no system of traditional values could stand against the rising tide of change. In these new and unfamiliar surroundings, he also became increasingly aware of the underlying complexities of American culture and started shifting towards a more open model of historical research, one that would be able to encompass and address such complexities. Informed by his experiences with the civil rights movement, Larry started his research into African American protests of the 20th century. Over time, however, this project evolved into an in-depth investigation of African American folk traditions before and after emancipation. Contrary to traditional concepts which held that African culture in America disappeared quickly under slavery, Lawrence Levine proposed a new interpretation of the African American experience, a dynamic view of a cultural group that through its rich oral traditions simultaneously preserved the elements of its original culture, but also had a major role in defining and enriching what we commonly perceive as American culture. Published in 1977, Black Culture and Black Consciousness influenced a whole generation of historians and heralded a cultural turn in our perception of American history. In his book, Highbrow, Lowbrow, published in 1983, he explored our prejudices associated with the ideas of high art and popular culture.
Let me see.
By demonstrating that higher forms of culture, such as Shakespeare, symphonies, jazz, art museums, even a stroll through Central Park, all have their origins in popular culture, Lawrence asked us to take off the mask of pretense and accept the fact that Shakespeare wore an earring. In 1983, Lawrence received a MacArthur grant. He was president of the Organization of American Historians and received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1994. Yet, these accolades didn't come without criticism. Lawrence and his unconventional notions of history came under scrutiny for relativizing true American values. In response to Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, which critiqued modern American universities as disseminators of relativism and nihilism in American culture, Lawrence wrote The Opening of the American Mind, a positive vision of American education and society. In his prologue, he writes, "The contemporary university, with its eclectic faculties and student bodies, its rich array of courses and programs, its dedication to expanding students' understanding of the diverse cultures and societies that surround them, has been drawn into the cultural conflict that characterize our time. This, then, is a brief book about the opening of the American mind from the early 19th century until now. It is also a plea on behalf of the steadfastness needed to keep our minds open, the courage required to live with the complexities of a deeper understanding of our culture and ourselves, and the honesty vital to an encounter with, rather than escape from, history." In 2002, just 4 years before his death, Lawrence Levine published his last book, this time with his wife, author Cornelia Levine. The book, titled The People and the President, America's Conversation with FDR, contained hundreds of original letters written to President Roosevelt as a response to his policies expressed in fireside chats. And although some of them expressed only the highest praise for the president's policies, while others contained hints of disappointment or even anger, one thing was certain: it was a history written by ordinary people.